I Barely Got Here is a collection of stories and conversations based on 24 years in law enforcement. You have the right to be disturbed by some of the content or disagree with the viewpoints. Anything you hear can and will be dosed with sarcasm and dark humor. You have the right to know that discussions will often be graphic with language and themes that are intended for a mature audience. Do you understand your rights? Then buckle up, Buttercup. We're going 10-8. Hello and welcome back to I Barely Got Here. I'm your host, Kevin Buncher. Tonight's episode, Eyeball. I was working on the downtown squad with my partner, Joe. It was evening and we were prowling around in the alleys off the main street just looking for people doing things they shouldn't be. Well, a blind call kicked out for a guy that was causing trouble at a dive bar we had down there called the 6 East Bar, which also happened to be the address, so it makes it pretty easy not to forget. Well, blind call is when dispatch kicks out the call and whoever's near or is able to accepts the call and responds to it. And they'll usually do that if there are no units available, hoping that someone can clear for it, or in our case, when there are officers that are working this downtown or a special event, dispatch doesn't really know where you are, what you're doing all the time, so they blind call a lot more down there. And normally, dispatch would assign a unit, a specific unit, based on their location or their beat assignment, and if they like you or not. You know, one of the first lessons that you learn as a new officer is you don't piss off dispatch, no matter what's going on. They have good and bad moments like everybody else does, but they control what happens to you to a great extent through your shift. You know, they can make things easier on you or they can make them worse. They can find a way to get you a break, to get something to eat, or they can just run you into the ground with calls. So that was always one of the first lessons that you taught your new rookies. Anyway, back to this blind call. So if the call sounds like it's a paper call or nothing that's going to be very exciting, well, sometimes it goes unanswered for a bit. But the converse is if it's anything with potential or it's exciting or, you know, anything like that, you're going to get people clearing from all over the place. You blind call a man with a gun or a vehicle pursuit or a robbery in progress, and you're going to get a response. Now, in the fortunate case where your home's burglarized while you're gone and there's no follow-up or any obvious action that's able to be taken by the police other than taking and writing a report, well, that's what we call a paper call. And that's a call nobody wants to go on unless they have to. And I know it sucks, and of course it's not necessarily the best way to do things, but that's just the way it is sometimes. So working this downtown beat brought with it the expectation that you'd always jump any call that was nearby. So as soon as Joe and I heard that call at 6 East, we jumped on the radio and said, hey, we'll take that. And it didn't sound, too exciting or anything, just somebody that didn't want to leave. So we're thinking, well, hopefully this will be a, okay, get out or you're going to go to jail admonishment, and then we'll be back on our own kind of looking for stuff in the alleyways. So we get there and we walk into the bar, and you always have to pause for a few seconds to let your eyes adjust. And it's always a really uncomfortable feeling because for that short amount of time, you're pretty vulnerable to getting, sucker punched or anything else. You just kind of act like you can see what's going on and hope that no one whacks you with a bottle. Well, 6 East is a small place. It's definitely not the typical college bar that most of the places are in our downtown. It's more of a local place, often with the added option of a lot of drugs for sale. We don't go there very often, and they kind of stay to themselves mostly, but we do try to catch them dealing out in the back of the bar once in a while. And further, they don't call us unless it's necessary. Sometimes they don't call us when they should, so we know that there's usually no BS calls here. So if we're going to something, there's probably something that needs done. Well, we spot who we think is the problem child right away. He's the drunk, loud guy at the end of the bar, angry about whatever, complaining that he can't get served. And then one of us keeps an eye on him, and the other contacts the bartender / manager / doorman of this place to find out what's going on. Well, the guy's hammered. He won't stop bugging people, and he won't leave. Came in by himself, so there's no friends to help get him out. He's not a local, so nobody really knows him enough to figure out just what his problem is. And the bartender tried to give him kind of a little nudge, escort out of the bar, but the guy shrugged him off and then started talking about, kicking his ass. So he backed off and made the phone call to us. You have to laugh because, kick your ass. I'm like, kick your ass. That is such a globally utilized statement, isn't it? I mean, you can select the language of choice, and it almost always implies impairment, poor judgment, and more often than not, the one making the statement is oftentimes the recipient of the ass kicking. Unless it's the cops saying it, and then probably should pay attention. Well, we get the story from the bartender, and again, they just want him out, which is common. So Joe and I approach this guy, ready to respond to his ass-kicking ways. He's loud still. He sees and recognizes us and thinks and says, we don't need to be there. Everything's fine. And we tell him, hey, you need to go. And he starts in with, well, this is America, and I can be wherever I want to be. Of course, Joe and I look at each other and, we laugh. We might have heard that a time or two or 100. So we explain, hey, listen, the bar doesn't want you in here. They have a right to say who stays and who goes. And if you don't go, well, we're going to make you leave. We've been patient. We've given him his opportunity to talk tough and make his statement, but now it's time to go. Well, he still refuses to go. So like so many times before and after that, Joe and I just kind of on autopilot get on either side, get his arms wrapped up and start moving him toward the door. And it happens so quick and he's so drunk that he doesn't even really catch what's happening until we've got him outside. And again, it's a small place. Well, then he decides he's going to resist a little bit and calling us names and being rude. So that results in his being shoved into the block wall right next to the door as we're trying to control him. And it kind of has a rough finish to it. So now he's getting his face all scratched up on this cinder block while we're trying to calm him down. Well, at this point, we tell him he's under arrest for the trespass because, he's just not smart enough to calm down and leave. And if we do let him go, it's clear that he's just going to spin and try to assault one of us and that we're going to have to deal with him all over again. And in a situation like this, the bar has to step up and say, okay, we'll aid in prosecution for the trespass. Otherwise, we don't really have anything else to push the issue for unless he were to do something else, like, assault one of us or committed some other crime aside from his not wanting to leave the bar, the whole reason for the complaint. Well, we tell dispatch we have a 1042 or a prisoner, and we ask for the transport wagon. Since we're on foot down there, we don't have a car, hence the transport. And as with many arrests that we make down there on the weekends, this wagon would hang around down there fairly close because we are always their best customer. In the meantime, we're filling out paperwork, booking paperwork. We've taken some notes and for the report that we'll have to write, and we start to process, search, deal with this prisoner, this suspect. Well, I'm collecting notes and marking arrest times and the address and just things I'll need for the report later on because I'm pretty sure that I was the one that was going to end up taking the paper on it, and Joe's dealing with the guy. And we'd already cuffed him up when we had him up against the wall earlier, and he had settled down a little, but he was still, non-compliant completely. So our Sergeant Ray shows up about then to check on things and make sure we're good. He heard us call out of 42, so he was just kind of doing what a good boss does, just checking on things. He pulls his car close by to us in the alley and gets out. And most of the time when you arrest someone, the easiest way to process that person is to get them kind of leaned over a hood or a trunk of a car, because that gives us some control over them, and it gives us a place to stack their crap as we pull it out of their pockets and their pants and their socks and their underwear and their shoes and everywhere else. So Ray was basically giving him a workplace to deal with the guy. Well, Joe pulls/pushes him over to the car while Ray's just kind of watching, and I'm still scribbling my notes. Joe gets him to the trunk, and of course the guy's not spreading his legs or doing the things he's supposed to do, and he's not leaning down over the trunk lid. So Joe kind of starts to push him over, and the guy kicks back at Joe. Well, this is a pretty common thing that you have to watch out for with people who are being combative, or really anybody. They back kick at you like a mule kick, or sometimes they can try to spin on you, or to a lesser extent, they try to headbutt you because they watch too many movies. Well, Joe happened to be paying attention, and so the kick didn't really connect. It was more kind of a glancing shot. But still, it's not pleasant, and it always elicits a quick response by us, any of which end with the suspect on the ground. And then you're held on the ground by the knees, hands, and the weight of a cop or two or maybe three to keep you there, and then hobbles. Or something similar to that can come into play if they don't calm down, but that didn't happen on this one. Nope, this time Ray stepped in. Now, Ray's one of those supervisors who always did his best to take care of his folks. We used to call him Uncle Ray as much as he'd tolerate it. I'd go on, but he still lives within driving distance. Anyway, so before Joe can begin to pull the suspect off the trunk of the car, and before I can kind of shove my stuff in my pocket and get over to help him out, Ray mutters something like, "Nobody kicks my officers," and he goes to laying hands on the guy. So he pulls the guy off the trunk, lifts him up to about waist height, and turns him horizontal, and from that point, Ray drops and or deposits him on the ground. Now, if you've listened to my podcast, this should sound familiar, as it's a technique that I've described, and I might have used a time or two, and it works pretty well. Well, as is usually the desired result, the fight's all out of him now, as well as his breath. We tell him, don't make us do that again, and, calm down. I think there's also the threat of the hobbles, but we didn't need to do that. The guy mellows out, and while he's definitely not pleasant, he didn't physically fight anymore. So he's pretty quiet, and he's only answering questions that are asked, and, hey, what's going to happen? Can I bond out? When's my IA? Blah, blah, blah. Well, the wagon shows up, and we finish the booking sheet and what paperwork we need to get him transported to our jail at our main station. Well, on a normal weekend night downtown, you could end your shift with, maybe a few different arrests and assists with a couple others and just, stacks of paperwork that you need to get done at some point before the end of your work week. And after you shipped a guy or a gal to jail, you usually wouldn't see him again, or at least until it went to court, which nearly none of those did. Most of what we did down there was either taken care of with a time served, or they pled out at their IA or their initial appearance the following morning. Unless there was something wrong. Well, the indicator for something wrong usually started with dispatch telling you that you needed to call the jail. William 1, please call the jail. There are a few reasons for those, and oftentimes it was a paperwork issue. You didn't fill out a form, you're missing something, you didn't say if you'd Mirandized them or not, you didn't ask all the medical questions, blah, blah, blah. And those are pretty easily dealt with, and if you're cool at the jailers, they'd sometimes just take care of that stuff for you without you having to go back up to the jail. Well, less common reasons for that dreaded call to jail, but often foreseen, was due to an injury. So if you booked someone into the jail with an injury, whether it was pre-cops or post-cops, the jail supervisor had to approve keeping them in the jail. Well, there are kind of three options on an injury situation. So one, it's minor and the person can stay. Think Band-Aid on a finger or, gauze on a knot on some guy's head. Two, treatment's needed, so fire's called to the jail, they treat them, and then they stay. And then three, the injury's deemed that it definitely needs medical attention more so than just a Band-Aid or a piece of gauze, and the person's transported to a hospital. Well, in the last two circumstances, it's much easier to do those out on the street prior to booking, which is what usually occurred. It was just easier for everybody. Because once you get someone into the jail and into kind of that sterilized environment, it's just a big pain for everybody involved. Well, nobody wants to worry about an injury. We'd always try to get them treated out on the street, like I said, but ultimately you just want to get them into jail. And if the injury was very severe, sometimes that meant you had to write additional paperwork to, document what occurred or justify that you had done it. And the worst was if they were taken to a hospital for treatment, because someone would have to stay with them the whole time until they were released back to our custody. Nobody wanted to do those. It's hours of standing, sitting, waiting for their treatment and release. And sometimes the person was exaggerating that injury or that pain just to try to get out of jail. I know that's surprising, but that did occur. We used to call it jailitis, or there's a few other terms for it. Cuffitis, I don't know. Funny how people get sick or start hurting once they know that they're going to jail. Anyway, but the last thing they think about is that you have to babysit them and what a pain in the butt it is. So, they really could care less. Well, again, on this night, I get that. Please call the jail from dispatch. So when we get a chance, I give them a call. And, I'm just kind of thinking and hoping that it's, like I said, it's a case of paperwork, or, maybe the guy is claiming that he got banged up when we struggled with him. I mean, the alley was pretty dark and we didn't get a really good view of the guy, but, either way, it shouldn't have been a big deal. Well, one of the jailers answers the phone. I say, hey, this is Booncher, and, can I talk to the supervisor, whoever it is that needed me to talk to? Well, the guy kind of laughs and he says something like, oh, you're going to love this one, and puts me on hold. So there's a short wait, and the supervisor picks up, and he says, hey, Kevin, we've kind of got an odd situation here with that guy that you shipped. I'm like, all right, well, what's up? He says, well, he's claiming that you knocked his eye out. I'm like, okay, with a wince and a laugh. This could be a bit of a problem. Well, I said, we did have to knock him around some, but I never saw an eyeball hanging down on his cheek at any point, and nothing we did would have caused that kind of injury anyway. So, he kind of lets me finish with this, but then he says, well, no, not a living eyeball, a glass eye. So I'm like, okay, glass eye. Well, this is a new one for me. So what's he saying? So the jail supervisor tells me the guy's claiming that when we knocked him around and dropped him on the ground, that we knocked his glass eye out of his head. And not knowing how a glass eye works in or out of somebody's head, I just have to kind of go, okay. And, I'll start backtracking and looking and trying to figure out how or where this may have occurred. So, and then I have to further ask him, I'm like, well, did you see the guy's face? Or are you sure that he's missing an eye? Or is this like third-hand information? It's like, nope, there's definitely a hole where his eye's supposed to be. And it's kind of creepy, to be honest with you. I said, okay, does he need medical treatment? He says, nope, he's fine. He's just pissed off and says he's missing his glass eye. I'm like, okay, well, I'll get back to you. Well, I tell Joe what's going on, and we both kind of laugh, but then we're thinking, crap, this is going to turn into a real pain in the butt, especially if it's true. So we go back to 6 East, and we check everywhere inside there and out front and in the alley, anywhere I suppose an eyeball could have rolled to, and there's nothing. There's really no vehicle traffic back in and around there or anything, so I'm not too worried about the thing getting run over. I mean, unless, one of the cop cars rolled over it. Well, the bartender says he doesn't remember anything about the guy having an eye or not having an eye, but he thinks he would have noticed if there's one missing. Well, then we call Ray and tell him what's going on, and, of course I say, hey, why'd you have to knock this guy's eye out of his head? Well, he's slightly amused, but he does have to admit it's kind of an odd one. He asks a few obvious questions and just says, okay, well, you know what you need to do, so just keep me updated. Well, we call the transport guys, the guys that are working the wagon, and we tell them what's going on, and once again, they think it's pretty funny. Hey, that's a new one. Well, part of working that wagon is that you have to search the rear area of the van every single time you offload prisoners to the jail, to make sure that nobody ditched anything, lost anything, left anything, shoved that dope behind that cushion or whatever. And the van back then was just basically the back of a regular sized van that was gutted, and then it had like padding on the floor and on the sides. They say that they took them and they dropped them off, and they didn't notice anything about him missing an eyeball. And then they said they searched right after they took him out, but they says, you know what, we'll search again. So they did. They searched the back of the wagon again, and still no eye. Well, now I'm beginning to think this is probably just a bunch of BS, and this guy's trying to either get us in trouble or, trying to minimize or get out of his charges and get out of there that night. Well, we did all this searching. We talked to people who dealt with him, and no one can really confirm anything one way or the other. And I think you'd notice if a guy was missing an eyeball, And I'd also think that if he was missing that eye, we could have missed it, seeing that had happened. We could have missed that in that dark alleyway, but not the transport guys and the jail staff and everything else in lighting. Well, at this point now, I have no choice, but I got to go to the jail and I got to talk to this guy to try to figure out what's going on. And be honest with you, I kind of want to see what he looks like too. So I cruise down to the jail and get my gun locked up, and I get buzzed in and go through all that rigmarole. And I go over to the little office, kind of like their little command center in the jail, and I shoot the shit with them for a second, and they give me crap. They're like, well, it's a little excessive, isn't it? Why you guys got to be knocking people's eyes out down there? I'm like, hey, just tell me what cell he's in. So I get the big set of keys and cruise down the hall to this guy's cell. And before you do anything with a person that's in a cell, you always look in this little door window port to make sure that they're not waiting to do something as soon as you open the door. Like as soon as we had people, like as soon as you click that latch, they slam that door open into you and, just become a big, huge problem. So anyway, I peel back the little magnetic thing that covers the window, and I see he's just sitting on the floor in there. And since he was kind of combative and apparently has continued to be a little bit, he's in a cell where there's nothing but kind of a combination toilet / drinking fountain, which I know sounds gross, but it's not terrible. No bed, no nothing else, concrete floor. So I open the door while I'm watching him and I reintroduce myself. Well, he's still being a jerk, and all he's really telling me is that we knocked his glass eye out. And I tell him, all right, well, stand up so I can see what he's talking about. And he does, and he faces me. And so I remember there wasn't like this just gaping hole where his left eye was supposed to be, but it was definitely obvious that there was something wrong there, and there was kind of a void. And it was like, I guess the tissue that would normally surround the eyeball was kind of squeezing into that void is the best way I can describe it. I don't know. It was weird, and I've never seen something like that before or since. Well, I tried to get him to nail down when it could have happened, because I don't really want to have actually lost this poor guy's glass eye. If we did, I'd like to try to get it figured out. And then I tell him that, nobody remembers anything odd or missing all the way until he got put into his individual cell. Well, he just says, well, it must have happened when we threw him down. And I look at the drain in the jail as I'm listening to him tell his story, which isn't a usual household drain. I mean, these things have to accommodate washing all sorts of nasty, filthy stuff away when you have to. So it's a large diameter drain. And then kind of for some of the same reasons, the screen that goes over that drain is fairly large also. And then my mind kicks to, it's just big enough that if you wanted to drop a glass eye in there, you could do it. So I kind of hit him with it point blank. I'm like, hey, did you do this? And he's like, no, he denies it, but he's not being very convincing. Well, after all that I've learned since his initial complaint, that's exactly what I think happened. Either that or put it down the toilet, which the toilet hole is not as big, but, I think it still could have done it. Well, I say, okay, well, what do you want done about this missing eye? And he gives kind of a weak argument that we need to get him a new one, or you need to get me out of here. But, it's not what I'd expect from someone who really had their glass eye knocked out of their head. And then once I told him that, what, I think I know there's a mechanism for us to check the drain pipes coming out of these cells. And his argument and his anger got even weaker. So then he eventually just basically says, forget it. I don't even care. I don't care what you do. I don't want to do anything more about it. And he just kind of slumps down on the floor again, leaning against a wall. And I think at that point, the alcohol had kind of subsided and he's having some semblance of reason again. And he's realizing, it was probably a pretty stupid thing to do, especially if they can check these pipes. So at least that's what I surmised. Well, I lock him back in and I go out and I ask the jailers about those drains. And they say, yeah, it's possible to scope them and you might even recover something. But they are designed to drain pretty well. And unless you caught it, pretty quick, it's probably more likely gone. And, by then it had been like a couple of hours. So I kind of gave up on that option. Well, I called Ray, and after some discussion, we concluded that, he probably had this thing in his head all along, but, once he got in an individual cell, that's when he decided that it may help his cause to drop it down that drain or, flush it. And since he said, hey, I don't want to file a complaint, the whole thing's over. What a moron. And as far as Joe and I, that's pretty much the end of it. And we go through the rest of our shift and, we tell the stories, people hear about it and ask us. And it's an odd one. And we make sure that we insinuate that, maybe Uncle Ray really did knock that guy's eye out. And it started with, hey, man, I heard your Sarge knocked a guy's eye out down on Mill. We're like, yeah, he did. Well, by the end of the week, due to no fault of our own, The story's kind of progressed to Ray picks this guy up over his head like, WWE wrestling. He slammed him to the ground, and that's when the dude's eye popped out. Well, then Ray picked it up, and he kicked it around like a hacky sack for a minute, and then, he kicked it right back into the guy's eye hole. And after that, we don't know what the guy did with his eye. And over the years, it grew some more legs, and, sometimes a glass eye turned into an actual eyeball, if you can imagine that. Somebody'd bring it up, and sometimes not knowing that I'd even been there, and start with, there's this downtown sergeant who knocked a guy's eye out once. They're never quite accurate, but always entertaining. I told that story at Ray's retirement ceremony and stuck true to the story as best I could remember. With that, I close this episode of I Barely Got Here. Thank you for listening, and if you like the show, please subscribe and post a review and ask your friends to give it a listen. If you have a question or a comment, please shoot me an email at ibarelygothere@gmail.com, and you can also follow me on Instagram and Facebook. Sam42 is 107.